This is a presentation of the 19th Annual Colorado Snow and Avalanche Workshop, a program of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, Friends of CAIC, and the National Avalanche Center, presented by Dinafit and Pomoka.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for taking the time to attend the 2020 Colorado Snow and Avalanche Workshop, virtual edition. Thanks to the folks at CAIC for figuring out how to put this on despite ongoing conditions in the world. And thanks to you all for taking the time to tune in. Without any further ado, we'll dive right in and see how this goes. All right, my name is VandenBos. I'm a forecaster at the Sawtooth Avalanche Center. It'll be my 5th winter there, and I'm here to talk to you about a pretty unique event that occurred in our forecast area this past spring. Here's a look at state of Idaho, and those colored polygons in the center are showing you where the Sawtooth Avalanche Center is. There's the location of Ketchum and Stanley, if anyone is familiar with the area and wants to know a little more where we are. And then this red asterisk here is the location of the epicenter for the magnitude 6.5 earthquake that occurred on the 31st of March this year. We're going to jump around in time a little bit in this presentation. We're going to start out right before the earthquake here, and fly back to the past, talk a little bit about early season weak layers, how they influenced the season and the earthquake avalanches, talk about some of the features we saw during the avalanches that failed around the time of the earthquake, and then finish by spending a little time talking about the aftershock sequence and what that means for us. First, we're going to watch this video that I took of myself. It's only mildly embarrassing. This is maybe 2 hours before the earthquake happened. And here we go. Give you a little sense for what it was like out there.
We're right exactly where we are, and what you can see is almost nothing. Yeah, you can't see much of anything. You can see there's a rock right there. I can see my ski poles, a couple trees, and yeah, that's what I got for you. Here we go.
So that gives you a little bit of a sense for what it was like prior to the earthquake. Breaking trail up to this point, there were about 3.5 feet of snow on the ground. I'm 6 feet tall and I was waist deep a good portion of the time. It was a real fight and a real slog, and yeah, that gives you a sense for what things were looking like going into that day. But let's dive back a little bit into the past and talk about how the snowpack had shaped up earlier in the year. Here's a photo of me taken middle December. This is on Galena Pass, about midway north or midway between Ketchum and Stanley. What you can see are a couple real prominent, obvious bands of service hoar that we buried in December, as well as that stack of depth hoar on the ground there. And traveling north into the Sawtooth, we've got a pretty similar snowpack. This photo is taken a little bit earlier because the 1211 service is here on the service in this photo, but the depth hoar is obvious in both. Make a quick note on that service hoar because it was such a widespread layer that was across our entire area, as widespread as anyone can remember seeing before, and it produced quite a few avalanches in touchy conditions early in the year. Here's a photo, December 13th, Friday the 13th. We're looking at 2 avalanches that I remotely triggered from the ridgeline above. 2 out of the 13 that I remotely triggered that day. So that's quite a touchy layer. But with time, as that service hoar was buried and the overlying slab slowly pushed its way into the feathers, integrated into them and pushed them over, we gained a lot of strength on that, and activity ceased on the service hoar. But the result of that was that the slab itself had gained a bit of internal strength, and it was starting to push more activity down to the depth hoar. Here's a photo or a video of me doing a PST. This is the 22nd of December. That's a 29 out of 100 to end on the PST. We were starting to get in the situation where it was harder to initiate fractures in PSTs, either getting, or ECTs rather, either getting ECTXs or ECTNs with hard force. But these results from PSTs were just continuing to show anywhere from 25 to about 35 out of 100 to end on this weak layer, clearly indicating to us that this was problematic if loaded in the appropriate way. And we didn't have to wait terribly long to see that ourselves. Here we're in the Sawtooth. This is Merritt Peak, and we're looking at a couple of big deep slab crowns. These crowns range from about 3 to 8 feet thick, and they're both about a quarter of a mile wide. Look at one more set of slides in the Sawtooth. This is Williams Peak near the Huts if you've spent much time there. And we're looking at a kind of a complex of crowns that's over 3,000 feet wide here at the base of the peak. This was from talking to everybody who's been around the area for a while, people who've lived there and forecasted, associated with the Avalanche Center and local guiding groups. This is the most widespread deep slab cycle in the Sawtooth in institutional memory. So here we are, it's mid-January. We've seen a wild cycle on surface hoar, a wild cycle on deep depth hoar, and we're just getting into 2020, which has been a hell of a year, as don't need to remind anybody. Here we are looking at height of snow at our weather station in the Sawtooth. This is starting the 23rd of January on the left side of the image, running to the start of April on the right side of the image. And what you can see is that not a whole lot happened in this period. We had these little spits of snow 6 inches, and then it'd wait a week, and snow 3 inches and wait a week. Danger during that time period was spent a lot of time in the moderate to low range with a couple of spikes up to considerable, but really after those two avalanche cycles to start the season, things had quieted down a bit. And then you can see, looking at the right side of that, that's the big storm that came in before the earthquake and during the earthquake. So obviously that's a pretty significant increase in snow. And that leads us to talk about the main event. Pulled this out of my forecast discussion from that morning. It was my forecast that day, and it was pretty clear to me, even at 4 or 5 in the morning, that things were on their way to being a whole lot different than they had been. I'll read this for you quick. Today is the first day in 2.5 months that we have high danger in our forecast area. Ongoing pandemic reminds us that the world can shift underneath your feet. The storm in progress should remind you of the same. It's been a weird winter to say the least, one marked by an overall lack of snowfall, long periods of relatively stable conditions. Today is different. If you choose to go into the backcountry, be prepared to deal with the full spectrum of midwinter avalanche hazards. Dial back your ambitions and build a wide safety margin into the way you travel in the mountains. So clearly it was evident to me that this was a day of transition, that we were going from relative stability to widespread instability, and hence the high danger rating and the expectation of seeing large avalanches. Here's a photo of a large avalanche that I found about 15 minutes before that movie we watched at the beginning of this presentation. This crown is 1 to 3 feet thick, involving just the new snow. A couple hundred feet wide from what I could see, but I really couldn't get anywhere near terrain where I could see this because of avalanche hazard. I'm sure there were other similar avalanches at that time. Again, this is before the earthquake of that evening. And then at about 6 p.m., a magnitude 6.5 earthquake released within our forecast zone at the north end of our forecast zone. I won't spend much time on these maps, but they both show information about that earthquake. We can see the Sawtooth Fault here on the right. This is the epicenter is at the yellow star here. It's thought that the earthquake involved the Sawtooth Fault, but that end of the Sawtooth Fault is not well mapped and not well understood. So there's still a lot of work being done on that. And on the left, this is kind of a neat way to look at the earthquake. We can tell from satellite imagery, we can actually map how much things are changing, moving up and down. It's called line of sight displacement. And this red is showing areas that have moved downwards, and the blues showing areas that have moved upwards. And the areas that have moved downwards have lost as many as 10 centimeters of height over the course of that earthquake. So the danger was high. I was finding avalanches already, and then this earthquake happened. And I immediately did what I've found myself doing frequently in the last number of years. I started to catalog all the avalanches that I could from the earthquake. We are looking about west in this image. In the foreground, this is the headwaters of the Salmon here. This is the Salmon River Valley. The town of Stanley is here. Epicenter is here, obviously. For scale, we're looking at about 40 miles from the epicenter to, this is Alturas Lake Creek drainage here. These are all the Satus. And those red crowns, those red lines that we can see are crowns that I mapped. I mapped 474 different crowns from this avalanche. I mapped them geospatially and then attached them to photographs so we could reference this cycle as we move forward in time. This is something I've been doing a number of times over the last couple of years. I think it's a great way to make a record, an avalanche center record, something that we can look back on to see how the snowpack and how the mountains behave under certain circumstances. Here's another view, another way that we looked at avalanches. On the right side of the image, we're looking about down the crest of the Sawtooth Mountain Range here. Right side of the image is the range front. Those are the things that you can see from the highway and you can access without walking more than about 10 miles. And those red and black lines are the crowns that I'd mapped. And then those blue polygons are showing remotely detected inferred piles of debris based on satellite imagery. Essentially, there's more, you have a significant increase in backscatter in those debris piles, thanks to increased density, because you're taking all the snow from above and compacting it, shoving it down the hill, and it ends up being significantly more dense than it was before. And so if you make these images as the satellite is revolving around the Earth, you have these images that taken before the avalanche cycle and after the avalanche cycle, and you can infer where these avalanches happen based on that. It's pretty fascinating. As you can see, very widespread activity, and in the areas where I was able to visit, and his data also covers, you can see there's pretty good agreement between the crowns above and those piles of debris below. There were a lot of avalanches that occurred. Obviously, I mapped 474, and that's a small portion of all the avalanches that occurred. And a lot of them had some pretty unique features. Some of the unique sort of features that we'd see were a lot of ragged crowns, debris stalled out on bed surfaces, obviously widespread rockfall, mass wasting events, these cracks that had formed all the way to the base of the snowpack, even in areas that didn't avalanche, seeing slabs on steep slopes, and lots of crowns lower and middle elevations. You expect to see them obviously in the Alpine where it's blowing and it's snowing, but they're going to be less common at middle elevations, but they were still quite widespread during this. Look at a few photos that illustrate those characteristics. We're about 45 miles southeast of the epicenter here. You can see some really ragged crowns. You can see that this avalanche stepped down kind of irregularly in a bunch of different places. Some places that stepped down and stalled out and then stepped back up. You can see these kind of step up lines in a number of spots. Definitely some odd looking slides. Here we are about 25 miles southeast of the epicenter. Up in the top, we can see, there are a few typical avalanches, the sort that you might see in the exposed Alpine, but we're also finding just this widespread activity in these lower and middle elevation paths, which is pretty unusual for the area or for anywhere. We're looking at the high point of the Sawtooth here. This is Thompson Peak. We can see a lot of gouging below these big cliff bands, these big gouged out surfaces, as well as widespread avalanche activity, even on these very steep slopes below the peak here. This is Horstman Peak in the Sawtooth. This is highly coveted ski descent, as you can imagine. Looks like a great thing to ski, and can confirm that it is. The top of this is a little over 50 degrees, and then it mellows out to the mid to upper 40s down where this crown is, and stays that way for the good portion of the duration. You can see this big, wide, ragged crown here, as well as all these exposed rocks here where a chunk of cornice was rattled loose by the earthquake, and likely by the earthquake, and sent down slope. Here's a little smaller scale feature, but a lot of these, when you visited these areas that had fractured and shifted, but not avalanched, you'd find that you have these slope parallel cracks, pretty similar to the sort of things that you normally see. If you triggered an avalanche on this slope, or you triggered a big collapse, you'd see all these cracks. But then you also have these offsetting cracks, which are real bizarre looking, and they all lined up relatively similarly. Most of those are striking about southwest northeast, and then would offset the earlier pattern of cracking. And I suspect these events probably took place quite closely in time, but it appears that based off the offset in those fractures, obviously the fractures that I've highlighted and read there post-date those other fractures. Here we are looking down out of a plane, and we can see some of these slope parallel cracks that I've been talking about. A few little pockets where things popped out, but a lot of the stuff didn't slide that deeply, but is still cracked all the way to the base of the snowpack, likely involving those areas where we didn't have deep slab avalanches earlier in the season on that depth ore. And then here's showing how it wasn't just cracking to the base of the snowpack. In some areas, we were actually triggering these deep slabs. We've talked about this at the Avalanche Center. We agreed that it seemed highly unlikely that these events would have happened these deep events would have happened in the absence of the earthquake. And here we are also in the Sawtooth, looking at there are plenty of avalanches to be seen, but more interesting portion of this is just the scale of the rockfall and the look of the powder blast here, the dust that was launched after that rock collapsed. Pretty interesting. And then one last photo here. We're in the Sawtooth, looking up the Redfish Creek drainage here. You can see a lot of avalanches. You can see a lot of rockfall. And in the back here, you can see the Barren Spire. And Barren Spire thinking about this spire helps bring us into the future a little bit. So over 4 months after the avalanche had failed, or after the earthquake had happened, excuse me, we have this ongoing series of aftershocks. And on the 7th of August, there's a 4.2 aftershock that dislodged the summit block of the Barren Spire that we were just looking at there. Some of you have seen this video. The commentary is amazing. I'll try to censor out any profanities, but it's worth a listen and a watch.
Rock. Dude, the rock is Smoothie's gone out the top. Smoothie's gone. Smoothie came down. Smoothie is gone. Is that the one that we're gonna climb tomorrow? Smoothie is gone. Holy crap. Holy.
All right, so there's that. I think maybe the best part of the commentary is the guy who kind of quietly asks in the background, "Is that what we're going to climb tomorrow?" A great reminder that geologic time includes right now. When you have these major earthquakes, you have these sequences of aftershocks that occur after them. And even though the earthquakes themselves aren't predictable, the aftershocks in bulk are predictable. The aftershock sequence for this earthquake has been pretty predictable and behaved the way we would anticipate. These red dots are showing aftershocks greater than magnitude 4. There have been 14 of those, and the models call for 16 to 17 magnitude 4 aftershocks out of this earthquake. So it seems like we're on pace for those. And one of these was the 4.2 aftershock that triggered the collapse of that Barren Spire. And there have been 1,900 total aftershocks as of September 24th when I'm recording this. The one thing that I didn't think about a lot until I started putting this presentation together is how important these aftershock sequences are. For us, since this took place, the earthquake took place March 31st, and then the weather was pretty quiet for the next 2 weeks until we shut up shop for the winter. We didn't really have to spend a whole lot of time thinking about this, but if this earthquake had taken place in November and we were looking at a winter with an ongoing aftershock sequence, it kind of changes the way that you think about it. You go from dealing with kind of what you see is what you get to essentially dealing with a deep slab-like problem, low probability, high consequence, incredibly difficult to predict or impossible to predict when and where something like that might happen. So here we're looking at this. This is the National Seismic Hazard Map. It's produced by the USGS. Areas in red are the brightest color is 100% likelihood of damaging shaking in 100 years. Green is 0%. Yellow is about the 50% line of that. But what you can see is that across the Intermountain West and the coastal West here, we have a lot of areas where damaging shaking is anticipated. And if we lay those boundaries of the forecast zones across this, you can see that there's a lot of avalanche centers that may have to deal with this at some point in the future. Here at the Sawtooth, obviously, we're in brighter colors. The Gallatin, Bridger Teton, northern portion of Utah, Colorado, looks like you're significantly less likely to deal with this. Obviously, California, less likely in Oregon than again, an increased chance up there in Washington. So most avalanche forecast centers are forecasting in areas where damaging earthquakes are indeed likely over longer time scales. And thinking about how you might deal with not the earthquake itself necessarily, but an aftershock sequence is something that we've been putting a lot of time into talking about, contemplating, and then hope to do additional work on that moving forward from here. Couldn't do any of this without a lot of help from a lot of other people. Zach and Scotty, like we mentioned at the beginning, got Zach Lifton and Claudio Berti, two guys who work for the Idaho Geological Survey. They've been extremely helpful. Chantel Astorga and Bill Nicholson, they're avalanche forecasters for the Idaho Transportation Department on the other side of the Sawtooth. They provide us with some really interesting information. Morgan Machete, Allison Shumway, and Ken Ruxtelis at the USGS also helped me a lot with the National Seismic Hazard Map and thinking about aftershocks and kind of how those sequence of aftershocks might affect avalanche forecasting. And then Soitros Valkaniotis, who is the geologist who produced those figures that I showed with kind of showing the aftershocks and the location of the faults and those. So that's kind of where we're sitting. That's where the future brings us to. But we know that the past is prologue to the present, and present's prologue to the future, and future just informs what will eventually be the past. And if we, I think, expand the way we think about earthquakes a little bit and the interplay between earthquakes and avalanches, there's a lot of interesting work to be done here, a lot of interesting things to think about, and hope this piqued your curiosity. And if you have any questions, feel free to track me down, send me an email, and ask away. And thanks for taking the time to tune in. I really appreciate it.